Hello, sisters. Lesbian Psychologies, Explorations and Challenges, edited by the Boston Lesbian Psychologies Collective. Part 3, Family. Essay number 12. Child-Rearing Attitudes of Black Lesbian Mothers by Marjorie Hill. Who is the lesbian mother, and what is unique about her? What is the effect of sexual orientation upon child-rearing attitudes? The lesbian mother has only recently become a focus of psychological investigation, even though 1/5 of lesbians have children. This chapter reports a study that I undertook to examine explicit differences in child-rearing attitudes between lesbian and heterosexual women. Within the comparatively small number of published studies on female homosexuality, the samples tend to be exclusively white, predominantly well-educated, and upwardly mobile. For my study, I used only Black subjects in order to raise some questions about the degree of applicability of previous studies. I assume that many of the issues discussed in this research can be generalized to other populations. The range of parent personalities and attitudes about child-rearing is as broad in lesbian mothers as that found in heterosexual mothers. The principal difference between lesbian mothers and heterosexual mothers is that lesbians present an alternative to the present traditional family structure. The existence of lesbian mothers, therefore, enables our society to view all social relationships in a new light. For the lesbian mother herself, there are no set guidelines to follow. The universal concerns and problems associated with parenthood, whether as a single parent, as a couple, or as communal parents, may be compounded by being a lesbian. At the same time, having to choose guidelines frees the lesbian mother to make parenting a more creative endeavor. Come sit. Okay. For people who assume that being a lesbian means rejecting all that is traditionally feminine, particularly motherhood, the lesbian quote-unquote family and lesbian mothers are often difficult to conceptualize. Many form unions that mirror traditional family patterns. Some have had children within the framework of a heterosexual relationship, often marriage. Adoption and artificial insemination are the other means that lesbians currently use to become mothers. Adoption agencies have increasingly allowed single women and men to adopt more difficult-to-place, older, or handicapped children, although most agencies prefer married couples. Women who wish to adopt through recognized agencies do not make an issue of their homosexuality because most agencies consider homosexuality undesirable in a potential parent. An example of this sort of homophobic bias is the decision of the Massachusetts Department of Social Services to take 2 foster children out of a gay male couple's family in response to public pressure, despite recent research that indicates that young children do not develop quote-unquote deviant traits solely as a result of being within gay individuals or gay parents. Being with gay individuals or gay parents. The problems of children of homosexuals may or may not be specifically linked to the parent's homosexuality. Most women in the lesbian community do not choose adoption, but rather deliberately get pregnant with a friend or by alternative insemination, with or without the quote-unquote father of their child realizing that a pregnancy has resulted from the encounter. The effects of children being raised within the context of a lesbian household are only recently being examined, and few empirical data are available. Martha Kirkpatrick, Ron Roy, and Catherine Smith base their findings on interviews and a battery of tests conducted with 20 Los Angeles children aged 5 to 12. The authors report some problems in these children, but the types of difficulties are the kind typically seen in children of divorced parents: conflicts of loyalties, a guilty concern over the cause of the parents split up, and anxiety about whether or not they will face future loss. The children did not form a transsexual self-image or reject gender-appropriate behaviors. Because so little literature went beyond discussion of custody issues for the lesbian mother and the influence of her lifestyle on her children, I determined to conduct a study to examine and identify explicit differences in child-rearing attitudes between lesbians and heterosexual women. The investigation was based on the premise that conscious and unconscious factors would have differing effects upon child rearing. Women who define themselves as lesbians have consciously acknowledged and accepted their homosexuality, and would therefore tend to manifest behaviors comparable to those behaviors cited in the current literature as more independent, more candid, resilient, and self-sufficient than their heterosexual counterparts. These attributes, I suspected, would be demonstrated in parenting styles and attitudes. Thus, I predicted that 1. Lesbian mothers would place a higher value on independence and self-sufficiency than heterosexual mothers. 2. Lesbian mothers would demonstrate more tolerance and tend to be more flexible about rules than heterosexual mothers. 3. Lesbians would express a preference for older children because of their more autonomous and independent behavior. 4. Lesbian mothers would be more tolerant of their children's sexuality than traditional mothers. 5. Lesbian mothers would be more candid than traditional mothers. 6. Lesbian mothers would view boys and girls as being more similar than do heterosexual mothers. 7. Lesbian mothers would express more traditionally masculine sex role expectations from their daughters. 8. Lesbians would tend to interfere more consistently with their children's relationships with their fathers. Subjects: a group of 26 lesbians and a group of 26 heterosexual mothers served as subjects in the study. All of the women were Black, and each had at least one child who was between the ages of 4 and 13. Sexual orientation was identified by the women themselves on the initial demographic questionnaire. For the purpose of the study, a lesbian mother was defined as one who acknowledged homosexuality with sexual attraction and interest in women, and was the biological mother of at least one child. The women were asked to choose their sexual preference among homosexual, bisexual, and heterosexual orientations. Any woman identifying herself as a bisexual was not included in the study. A total of 63 women agreed to participate. 6 women identified themselves as bisexuals, 26 homosexuals, 26 heterosexuals, and 5 elected not to state sexual preference. Lesbian subjects ranged in age from 24 to 41, X equals 30.34, while heterosexual subjects ranged in age from 21 to 41, X equals 29.65. Thus, there was no significant differences in age between the two groups. T50 equals 0.55, P more than 0.55. Lesbian mothers were averaged 1.4 children, and heterosexual mothers averaged 2.0 children. 27%, 7 mothers, of both samples were single parents living alone with their children. 43% of the lesbian mothers lived with their lover, while 65% of heterosexual mothers lived with boyfriends or husbands. Education was predominantly at the high school graduate or Associate of Arts graduate level for both groups, although the lesbians had more education on the average. 11 lesbians and 26 heterosexuals were high school graduates, and 6 lesbians and 6 heterosexuals were Associates of Art degrees. 6 lesbians had BA degrees, and 3 had an MA degree. I recruited the women. Because many of them were recruited from 2 lesbian organizations, Mothers & Co., a Black lesbian mothers discussion group, and Salsa Soul Third World Gay Women, Inc. I attempted to recruit heterosexual mothers from comparable straight organizations. Several of these mothers were active members in the Head Start Parents Group or in Black Women's Collective, a tri-state organization in New England that focuses on consciousness raising for Black women. Subjects themselves also provided additional contacts who participated in the study. Method. I gave to each subject a packet containing an introductory letter, a consent to participate form, and 5 questionnaires. The first of the questionnaires that I developed requested detailed demographic data. The Child Rearing Practices questionnaire contained 131 items relating to attitudes about punishment, independence, necessity for rules, spouse involvement, and a preference for older or younger children. The perceived sex role questionnaire contrasted mothers' perceptions of boys and girls, explicitly measuring how similar or dissimilar the sexes were viewed. The expected sex role questionnaire consisted of 2 sections, boys and girls, on which mothers had to select, on a 5-point scale, the importance of certain attributes important to successful adjustment. Although I collected information on both boys and girls, for the purposes of the study, I analyzed only information on the expectations of the girls. The final questionnaire I constructed was on sex training. It measured a mother's degree of permissiveness in 3 areas: information control, modesty, and sex play. I provided a separate sheet for additional comments. Questionnaires were administered in such a manner as to guarantee anonymity and thereby ensure confidentiality. Subjects were apprised of this fact and further informed that total testing was approximately an hour and a half. Most subjects were given the packets at home, while few with more flexible work situations chose to receive them at their place of employment. Several of the mothers from the Head Start group filled out the questionnaire in the parents' room. Those subjects who asked about the purpose of the investigation were informed after the interview was completed. Results. To test the hypotheses of the present study, I used individual t-test for independent sample means, Table 1. The first hypothesis, which states lesbian mothers will place a higher value on independence and self-sufficiency than heterosexual mothers, was not supported. T50 equals 1.81, P less than 0.05. Thus, there is no evidence that lesbians would be more likely to foster these attributes in their children than heterosexual women. Similarly, the preference for older children, because of the more autonomous and independent behaviors that they manifest, was not supported. T50 equals 0.868, P more than 0.5. Lesbian mothers were hypothesized to be more tolerant and to demonstrate more flexibility about child-rearing rules. Level of rules of behavior used, Factor 2, Child Rearing Practice Questionnaire, evidenced a significant difference between the 2 groups. T50 equals 2.37, p less than 0.05, such as that heterosexuals demand adherence to rules more frequently than did the lesbian subjects. Lesbian mothers as a group demonstrated more tolerance of children's sexuality than did heterosexual mothers. T50 equals 4.42, p less than 0.001. Further analysis of subscale items also yielded statistically significant results. Lesbian mothers evidenced more permissiveness about modesty. T50 equals 2.12, p less than 0.05. About sex play, T50 equals 4.55, p is less than 0.001, and greater openness in giving information, T50 equals 2.26, p is less than 0.05. A mother's tendency to be more candid was measured by factor 7 on the child rearing practice questionnaire. There was no statistically significant difference evidenced in candor between lesbians and heterosexuals. T50 equals 1.46, p is less than 0.05. Compared to heterosexual mothers, lesbian mothers as a group rated their perceptions of boys and girls as being more similar than dissimilar. Thus, the hypothesis that lesbian mothers viewed male and female children as more similar than their heterosexual counterparts was confirmed. T50 equals 2.62, p is less than 0.01. Lesbian mothers did express more traditionally masculine role expectations of their daughters than did heterosexual mothers. T50 equals 3.25, p is less than 0.001. There was, however, no significant difference between the groups of mothers in tendency to interfere with their child's relationships with their fathers, both groups having identical means and standard deviations. Interpretation. Before turning to the specifics of the study, it is important to consider the research context within which it was carried out. The paucity of research on lesbians, and especially on lesbians of color and lesbians in non-stereotypical roles such as motherhood. Some studies reviewed explicitly stated that the sample was exclusively white, while many did not specify. Alan Bell and Martin Wienberg specifically addressed the poor representation of Black gay men and lesbians in the literature and attempted to rectify this situation in their study. Furthermore, we must realize that the phenomenology of any given variable may differ for Black subjects. Because the issue of race suggests that it may not be possible to generalize comparisons of data based on exclusively or predominantly white groups of lesbians with other racial groups, then the racial homogeneity of the present sample may be of importance, either equal to or exceeding orientation. Just as motherhood is complex, so are Blackness, femaleness, and gayness. It was beyond the scope of my project to investigate how the women in my study have reconciled these various attributes. Thus, it is plausible that some of the variables that I studied may address issues extremely relevant to being Black, whereas others may relate to sexual preference. For example, findings did not support the hypotheses that lesbian mothers would place a higher value on independence and self-sufficiency than heterosexual mothers, and that they would also prefer older children because of more autonomous and independent behaviors. These results do not mean that independence is not stressed by gay or straight subjects, but rather that there is no statistically significant difference between the two groups. One interpretation is that independence is quite important to Black women regardless of sexual preference. Thus, no difference was demonstrated. In fact, Robert Hill points out the self-reliance of Black women, which would also encourage and value independence. Likewise, degree of candor, also studied in the current psychological literature, revealed no significant difference between the two groups. Again, it is possible that openness and candor may be valued similarly by Black women as a group, and sexual orientation may be of less consequence. It is also possible that agreement to participate in the study and affinity with the investigator, who is a Black woman, may have elicited a similar degree of candor from both lesbians and heterosexual women. In fact, several subjects from both groups agreed to participate because they felt it was important for Black women to work together and be supportive of one another. It is also possible that my measure of candor did not measure what I wanted. Note, for example, that 6 heterosexual subjects did not answer the question about what age they began current sex activity, whereas all lesbian subjects answered this question. It is possible that overall candor was not different, but that disclosure around certain subjects, i.e. sex, may be different for the two samples. Mark Friedman also found some indications of more general openness and candor for lesbians, in contrast to heterosexuals, a phenomenon that may also have been topic related. The hypothesis comparing mothers' flexibility yielded a significant difference between the gay and straight samples. Heterosexual mothers tended to have more rules and be less flexible about transgressions. The lesbians' flexibility can perhaps be understood as an outgrowth of having accepted an alternative lifestyle and therefore having developed a greater tolerance as individuals, which in turn extended to their rules as mothers. In the process of accepting one's lesbianism, a woman re-examines other kinds of social relationships. The presence of relatively few lesbian family models would suggest that developing and modulating a family system would require relatively more flexibility than adhering to or modifying a more traditional family pattern. Lesbian mothers have to keep in mind that they are building new family structures even though they are not sure what the completed form will be. Thus, adaptability and flexibility are indicated strongly. Not all the lesbians in my sample were quote-unquote out. Lesbian mothers' acceptance and acknowledgement of their own sexuality suggests that they would have more tolerant attitudes about their children's sexuality. In a more detailed analysis of these components of tolerance, lesbian mothers as a group reported more permissive attitudes about modesty, more openness about sexual information, and more acceptance of sex play than their heterosexual counterparts. For example, lesbian mothers tended not to get overly excited about self-stimulation, but viewed it as a natural phenomenon. Their permissive attitude did not encourage sex play or bombard the child with excessive information, but seemed to facilitate handling these issues in a less rigid, stereotyped fashion. I suspect that identity of sexual preference was a key factor in permissiveness. However, it is possible that level of education may have also had an effect on degree of permissiveness. 35% of the lesbian sample had a BA or MA degree, compared to the heterosexual sample who had completed at most 2 years of college education. These results are comparable to those cited by F. E. Kenyon, who found that in his sample more lesbians had university educations than heterosexual women. It is, of course, possible that both sexual preference and, to some extent, education affected mothers' attitudes about sex training. The hypothesis investigating mothers' perceptions of boys and girls, specifically that lesbian mothers tended to view children as more similar than heterosexual mothers, was confirmed. One explanation could be that lesbian mothers appreciated the androgynous nature of their boys and girls and therefore saw them as less different from one another than did heterosexual mothers. Another possible interpretation could be that lesbian mothers saw boys as more effeminate and consequently not different from girls, or they saw girls as more masculine and hence not different from boys. The results from the expected sex role questionnaire yield some insight on these interpretations. Lesbian mothers did express more traditionally masculine role expectations of their daughters. Similarly, the two groups of mothers differed greatly on their support of the Equal Rights Amendment, from which their feelings about women's rights can be inferred. The lesbian mothers supported the ERA 24-2. The heterosexual women were more equally divided on this issue, with 15 out of 26 supporting the ERA. It appears that the lesbian mothers have consistently less traditional ideas relating to the stereotypical feminine role. Maleness is perhaps viewed as less powerful only because femaleness is imbued with the potential to be more powerful. Political awareness and consciousness, although not explicitly explained in this present study, no doubt have an effect on some of the opinions expressed. More of the gay subjects were affiliated with and recruited from lesbian organizations than straight women from heterosexual organizations. Although some gay women were not members or actually involved, there seemed to be an acknowledgement of the significance of group identity. For example, Mothers & Co. was formed out of a need for a support group that addressed issues specific to these women. In contrast, the Head Start Parents Group was formed by Head Start to encourage parents, primarily mothers, involvement. The clear difference is that if a heterosexual mother elected not to be in the group that I sampled, there are myriad of other existing bodies in which she could belong, and from which she could obtain support. It is possible that not having the option to choose many groups or specifically selecting a lesbian group would suggest a more political ideology. Thus, affiliation with a lesbian organization may be a political statement in and of itself. Several studies recruiting lesbians from gay organizations have addressed this issue. Furthermore, there is some suggestion that these particular quote-unquote types of lesbians may not be typical of lesbians in general. There is no significant difference between lesbian and heterosexual mothers in tendency to interfere with their child's relationships with their fathers. None of the sample reported not knowing who the father was. In fact, in response to the question, quote, "Have you done anything to alter the amount of time father sees child?" end quote, 58% of each group answered no. The remaining 42% of heterosexual mothers and 35% of lesbian mothers had encouraged the father to see the child more often, while one-third of lesbian mothers discouraged the father, and one lesbian mother did not allow the father to see the child. It is interesting that no difference was discernible, especially since 61% of the gay women were separated or divorced, compared to only 15% of the straight women. The underlying premise on which my investigation was based was that factors in the realm of consciousness would facilitate parenting, and those indicative of unconscious conflict would interfere or have a negative effect. Fostering independence, flexibility about rules, perceptions of male and female roles, and permissive attitudes regarding sexuality were those variables that related to the conscious domain in my subjects. Under the assumptions of traditional psychology, two other findings would be considered to reflect the quote-unquote negative results of lesbians' unconscious conflicts. Their more traditionally masculine role expectations of their daughters, resulting from a prolonged masculinity complex as Freud suggested, and an increased tendency to interfere with their father's relationship with his child. Disappointment in the father, hostile feelings towards the father or father role, according to Dutch and Horney, and would be seen as not conducive to the ideal parenting model. I maintain that these may be better viewed as positive factors for the child. In our society, it might be extremely helpful for a mother to have more traditionally masculine expectations for her daughter. Similarly, good judgment rather than quote-unquote unconscious motives might be the cause of a mother limiting or refusing visitation rights to a child's father. Implications of future research. The results and implications of the study I have described lend themselves to suggestions for future research. As this book begins to do for the realm of lesbian psychology, the area of female homosexuality needs more research. A closer examination of race, ethnic origin, socioeconomic status, and degree of quote-unquote outness needs to be addressed to fill the gaps in the literature on lesbian personality. Attempts to delineate variables, effects, and interactions upon each other, i.e., blackness and gayness, would aid to clarify the strengths and needs of this population. A replication of this study using white women would perhaps provide some insight on the modulation of race and sexual preference on parenting. The inclusion of a third group, bisexual mothers, would also provide an interesting replication of this study, particularly in exploring whether bisexual mothers' attitudes would more clearly resemble heterosexual mothers or lesbian mothers' attitudes about child rearing. There is certainly a need for more research on lesbian mothers, not focused on custody cases and legal cases, but rather dealing with child rearing and issues specific to being a gay mother. When and how should a child be told of his or her mother's sexual preference? What are the positive or problematic effects upon a child of mothers being out in the community or school? What are the effects of secrecy or being in the closet? Do children of lesbians have greater options in choosing their sexual orientation and lifestyle in general? Another issue not addressed explicitly in my study was the lesbian mother's expectations of her sons. Male children pose a dilemma for gay mothers, and many are concerned about bringing up their sons as well as their daughters in a non-sexist way. It is possible that reflecting upon the similarities or differences in the raising of sons in lesbian households might provide new models or new understandings of the development of sex role stereotypes in our society. The combined results of such research would be invaluable to educators, parents, and society at large.